going to just say a couple of things, but David already is officially the Zoom co-host, so please jump in at any time. And in fact, as it works out, you'll see if you got the list, there's 7 students that we're reviewing today. I happen to have a full complement of 6, and David has 1. So for most of the students, other than the first student, Richard, it'll be my own student, so I'm going to tend to shut up. I'll mention as well that there's they weren't listed this way, but 2 of the students, Yi Yang and Siyu, they're on the same camera and they're on the same project. So we'll actually be looking at 6 projects over the course of the afternoon. Oh, there's Kayun. Hey, Kayun. So here's what we have is this is a little bit of experiments in pedagogy here, because the miniatures, I suppose, Abigail, you did the miniatures at Hauser and Wirth? I noticed some recent graduates in their resume having exhibited at Hauser and Wirth.
Well, Florencia always boasted as saying we can say we exhibited.
You know, you would make a little model, and it was really an event. We would all sit under the canopies there in the courtyard of Hauser and Wirth, and in the asterisk courtyard, the courtyard of Hauser and Wirth, and it was very informal, and it was just a chance, usually a little earlier in the semester than this, if I'm not mistaken, to have a kind of in-house chat, sometimes with a couple of other people. And sometimes there was an event afterwards, including alumni. Everything is different this year, including what the notion of miniatures is. And I realize of my 6, 3 did not even do a miniature, and they had to drop it off somewhere. They photographed it. They gave it back to us. And so what I asked, and I think this may be the case with Richard as well, but what we thought is, we're going to try to keep our schedule as close as possible. We're about 10 minutes behind, but that's okay, because we have 2 people going as one team. But I want to, if you don't mind, I'm going to let the students have 20 minutes. I'm going to let each student take the screen. And they're supposed to take a couple of minutes, but frankly, they can take as long as they like. It will just cut into our comment time. It is really very, I think the spirit of it is it's very informal. It's whether students want to talk about their projects, issues related to it, or whatever. And we're going to try to keep it just in an atmosphere of where do you want to go, what can you do, etc. Oh, yeah, thank you. Yes, absolutely right. And so the jury, everyone knows David Eskenazi and myself. And then we have 4 illustrious alums. We have Joe Day, whom a lot of you know also from teaching at SCI-Arc, and has been active on the board, and has a whole series of roles, and has for some time with SCI-Arc. Deborah Garcia, 4 years, how long ago did you graduate? BARC.
I graduated in 2017.
Oh, so there you go. From there, and then went on to Princeton, whose review I don't think I was on your final review at SCI-Arc, but I was on your final review at Princeton, and now is teaching at Georgia Tech. Teaching at Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas, but escaped safely ensconced in Marfa for a while. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Jason Payne, who needs no introduction. Probably, I hope, professor at UCLA, principal of Hirsuta, and I think graduated 6 years ago, we figured, from SCI-Arc 6 years ago. That's right. And then Abigail Warners, who graduated 3 years ago from an MARC 1. And you are in LA, and I don't know what you're up to, some illustrious.
I work at Morphosis as a project designer.
Who?
Morphosis.
Oh, I forgot. Just joking. Mm-hmm. Joking. A founder of SCI-Arc, and working for a founder and faculty of SCI-Arc. So we keep it close, Florencia, around here.
Yes, exactly. Hi guys, I'm jumping.
Hi Florencia.
I'm jumping into my reviews on another one, so I'm just in and out just to say hi. Hi Abby, Deborah. I say hi Deborah. Nice to see you, Abby. Hi Jason, and then Joe. Yes. Thank you everybody for joining us. This is our second session. You know, we had a whole morning of reviews. And I think that, you know, all the projects went great. Vincent was there in the morning. His review was there. I see you, Vincent, was in the morning. So I think it was a, you know, I mean, it's a completely different format, but it's one where, you know, that it's one that it works actually, I think. So I think so we look forward to a great conversation this afternoon. I'll be taking in and out, but I just wanted to say hi. Thank you, Andrew and David.
My pleasure, good to see you. Okay, well, without further ado, as we say, let's just go right into it, and we'll start with, Richard, is your last name pronounced Mapes?
Yes, it is.
Richard Mapes, take it away.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here really quick. Okay, can everyone see the perfect boyfriend builder text?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm just gonna start by sharing 5 or so slides, and then I'm gonna jump into a video to which I'll put the link. It's a YouTube link, and I'll put that in the chat. So as soon as I prompt you to do so, please watch that video on your device, and then we'll all reconvene after we're done. So diving in, for the early investigations of a few initial ideas, I've been working simultaneously in 5 different formats, which will be displayed in the video. The formats are social media posts that I've been exploring as playing cards instead of a news feed. And this introduces an interest in the personal and how one curates references for themselves. Collages, which are driven by the playing cards and engage different ways of working while meditating on legibility. This came from a timely interest in understanding the construction of the self. A board game, which is the submission for miniatures, which is used to create environments in, in parallel to the collaging exercises. An application which seeks to make the maker kit available to many people online. And finally, a feature animation, which is an attempt at understanding the relationships between elements in a scene and their composite legibility as unique constructions. Starting with the personal and arriving at animated environments is a desire to reveal points of contact between the personal and cultural constructions. So with that, I'll go ahead and share the link in the chat, which for some reason, I don't see the chat window.
Maybe you have to unshare.
Oh yeah, okay. Okay, so go ahead and watch that video. Give me a high five or a thumbs up when you're done watching it, and then I'll jump in with one closing sentence, and then we'll...
I don't care if I'm wrong. He's gotta have muscles.
All right, so my video is about wrapping up. Let me know when you're done and we'll jump back in. Okay, is anyone still watching the video? Nope. Okay. So just as a few closing thoughts, again, the interests of the project are the construction of the self and legibility, and also sets of references and where those references come from and how we might be able to employ a way of working to be able to shift our focus to uncover and then address blind spots. I see this project as an additive one, not a critical one. And so if you have any comments on whether or not that was successful in the video, please let me know. And lastly, I think I'm also very interested in your comments in terms of what format or formats, plural, that I might use moving forward as I continue to explore this project. So thank you very much.
I'll say just quickly, thank you, Richard, for the presentation. It was great.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, additive. That would be the that would be a term that jumps to. Yeah, no, I mean, it was fantastic. Just, I mean, so it's funny, and then when you start to analyze it, of course, that kind of ruins a lot of it. But the very last thing. I mean, you know, so you obviously you didn't end up with like a kind of Frankenstein golem person. You ended up with that environment, which was quite interesting. Is that a kind of, well, I'm gonna say I noted that, and maybe there was too much remixing the same material. I don't know how else to put it. And then the cards, and then the cards, and I mix the cards, I mix the cards. Like, I mean, this is not, it's a dumb criticism for something that you put together so nicely, but I guess there's this additive, like it's some kind of like crazy mountain. And I guess I don't have a clear idea of what to give you as a suggestion other than I want to see more of the kind of crazy mountain that results and not so much of the process as it goes on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think it's a pleasure just to try to make sense of what you're doing with this thesis. And I think you've actually accomplished one thing that a lot of thesis projects really struggle with and are haunted by all the way through the end of the semester, which is just making sense of the vast body of research they do and getting that to play in some formative and positive and useful role rather than just as kind of atmospheric distraction. I think you've figured out how to systematize things. I'm wondering, and I'm presuming that you and David have talked about Kenneth Anger's films. It looks, if not, check them out because you're definitely in his lineage in a great way. I think you'll find them really, really interesting for how he makes, you know, most of his films date from maybe the late 50s, a lot of them the 60s. So there's a lot of sort of late surrealist superimposition to them, which reminded me actually of, or brings me to what Andrew said about kind of the environment versus the figure. And to me, your thesis touches on a really interesting an interesting bifurcation that is easiest to explain, I think, in terms of surrealism. So in surrealism, in pre-World War II surrealism, surrealism is about the objects that are generated in dreams for the most part. You know, both before and after the war, it's about the unconscious and kind of mapping the unconscious often through dreams. But before the war, it's these object riddles. And after the war, it becomes more environmental. And most of the surrealists who really become important in the 40s and the 40s and the 50s, the late surrealists, are environmental. And I think you're actually sort of in their territory and might want to systematize how you oscillate between those two ambitions in some way. But it's, you know, I like just the whole DJ motif, I think, is working really well for you. I think I wonder actually if everything gets subsumed into that logic, or whether it plays against your final presentation in some way. But that gets to bigger questions about how thesis works these days too. So, right.
I think it is interesting that you kind of like, with social media and everything these days, and how you've really riffed off of all the different ways that people are doing unboxing videos and just scrolling, and not even just like the way that people present themselves on social media, but also through what they like. You've kind of generated this idea of kind of three senses of self, where there's like who you portray yourself on social media, who you actually are, and what you kind of desire. And I think there is a little bit of a disconnect between like all of your the perfect boyfriend builder leading into what this virtual environment is. And I think there is kind of like a good parallel, like what Joe is saying with surrealism, where maybe it becomes like your perfect boyfriend is maybe more of like a virtual kind of experience. And maybe that's kind of a medium that you could look into, where you kind of have this surreal boyfriend kind of in your head rather than an actual physical thing that manifests. But yeah, I think there's just a little bit of a disjoint between the two, but you're at a good stage right now. And I think that's perfectly normal to be at miniatures and trying to figure out how to make that jump.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you for that comment. I mean, it's interesting. David and I have been talking about the application, which we might move forward and develop into an actual web-based application that people can log on and use. So I think there is definitely a part of like a virtual discussion in this as well. So thank you for bringing that up. I completely forgot about that.
I just wanted to bring up a couple of points that I think are quite connected to all of the comments thus far. The first has to do with this, the format question that you ended your presentation with. And I have a question back to you on format. How constricted did you feel, or do you feel, by, let's say, kind of pre-existing strong tropes or, you know, characteristics that YouTube or other social media platforms like that would bring to the work already? You know, they talk all the time, or they used to, about not Pinterest space, but what's the other platform I'm thinking of? The Kardashians are constantly on Instagram. So it's a kind of Instagram aesthetic that develops. It felt to me a bit like that was happening here. You know, it's like, are you trying, you know, the way PewDiePie basically took that aesthetic and kind of made it his own in a certain sense. So in a way, he doubles down on the look and feel and atmospherics of online kind of image presentation. Or is that not the approach? That, like, would you rather have more room to maneuver in terms of the kind of aesthetic ethos of the work? And if so, is the way it's formatted or presented, is it going to bring with it just too many pre-existing constraints?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm going to have to ponder on it for a while. I think my gut reaction would be you know, when you think about all of these different formats and then specifically influencers, like I specifically took on the role of the influencer in the video as someone who's doing an unboxing. And I think that may be more closely related to my ideas on blind spots with respect to references. Like what are the motives of choosing any one of these modes of communication or any one of these platforms, and then how does the message change if you jump from one platform to another? So I think in the end, for me, it would, again, this is just a gut reaction, but it seems like every platform ever would have to be considered in order to get kind of a clear image of the actual perfect boyfriend. Does that clarify anything?
Yeah. I mean, it so complicates the world, doesn't it? But it feels like it complicates the world. But yeah, I understand your answer. The other thing I wanted to bring up, I think that it tags on to the last part of what Andrew was talking about, specifically to do with the very last stuff you showed, the kind of hot tub environment. There's a kind of environmental actual object, spatial object that had been modeled and developed. And I don't know if I detected any disappointment in Andrew or not, that was not somehow more pronounced a part of the project as the rest. But for me, I felt a bit of disappointment for a couple of reasons. One good, one bad, probably bad. The good one is that I thought it was cool. Like basically, I thought it was a great like design object, and I'm just love that sort of thing. So that one looked like something I'd really like to see more of. That's the good thing. The bad was maybe it's reflexive on my part to expect that at the end of the thesis presentation.
Oh, breaking up.
Froze.
Physical building, and that somehow is more primary in the presentation.
Then you froze.
Okay. At the end of the thesis, I think we, or at least I, reflexively expect, and this is the bad thing, that it all culminates in a building, or in your case, in this kind of hot tub environmental object thing. And maybe that's a bad reflex. So I put that back to you. Was it, it seemed intentional that there be a kind of real ambivalence or equivalence between, say, that design object in the end and everything else, a kind of horizontal kind of landscape, conceptual land. Is that it came across that way to me quite strongly. Is that a good reading of it, or should that last part be more somehow more there?
That's a really, really good point. I mean, it's also at the end of the video, there were 3 different environments that were made that kind of were shown through the lens of that application. And so I think, yeah, the emergent spaces for me, based on the references that were being used, I don't see them as unimportant, but I do see them as results of the references that are in play. And so perhaps it does kind of kick the building project out of the way for a moment to talk about ways of working, I suppose.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough.
Can I just make this, and I'm going to say something about that, Richard, and then it's, don't take it as either your responsibility or a criticism of your work, but there is, it seems like there ought to be a kind of, if a construction of an argument away from a building project, that SCI-Arc has become very easy to simply have that as a non-question stance. And I think it in the end, it somehow sort of depoliticizes things, because everyone thinks, well, that's fine. And then, you know, I'm going to go work on buildings and go to a firm or something like that. So if there is some kind of dismantling That is something, I mean, I'm going to show my thesis later. You'll see there was not a building anywhere in sight, I assure you. But there's a kind of dismantling of the building project that I think ought to be presented as, like the fact that if someone isn't doing a building, that should somehow be thematic in the thesis itself. Or institutionally, we have some responsibility to make that thematic, and it seems as if we don't do that.
I wanted to maybe a couple things. First of all, I really loved it, and I think there's something really timely about it, right? I think right now we're all in front of our computers, we're constantly looking at stuff, and there's a couple things. One, I put it into the group chat. I took a screen grab at 6 minutes, 5 seconds, because like I lost my shit. Because you're literally duplicating or almost reenacting Cindy Sherman's Untitled 167. I had to like Google it really quickly. And again, the beauty of online reviews, you could just like Google things and references. But the mirror, the image of yourself in the mirror as you're speaking, right? Like Untitled 167 is literally Cindy Sherman dismembers herself, right? And there's a kind of dismembership that's happening. And the number one reason why I love that shot of you is because you unboxed and you've spilled all these objects onto the table, and you're talking amidst this like mess of stuff. And suddenly it's not just a virtual game, you're literally having an effect on your environment at your desk in front of your computer as a person. And, you know, unboxing is not so clean, right? It's not such a kind of clean, we could say one-to-one translation between the app and the virtual and then the physicality of it, right? So, there's a lot of services that are about mailing something to your door, then you open it up in your living room, your bedroom, make a huge mess, right? You have crates and you have packaging and you have bubble wrap and then maybe you have a product, right? Somewhere amidst all of this, maybe there's a product. And I had this kind of feeling that in fact, what you're maybe insinuating has more to do with a kind of disorder of parts that begins to spill literally from the virtual into a physical in a much more, in a much less, I think, complicated way. It's quite dumb and quite fantastic, right? It's like order this box and build your boyfriend. Actually, you're gonna have to do a lot of building. You're gonna have to put things together. You're gonna have to cut things. You're gonna have to, and that's quite interesting, right? There's a lot of labor kind of embedded into it. So that's one of the things that I kind of thought about. The other thing is that I would maybe steer away from the identity of saying you took on the identity of the influencer. The influencer is essentially just taking on the identity of a consumer, right? I would just cut the influencing part out. Just go straight to whatever this thing is. It's being activated at the level of consumption in the domestic space or wherever it is that you want to envision this thing happening, right? The other thing would be New Domestic Landscapes was a show at MoMA in I think 1972 or whatever. You see all these like Italian modernism ideas of what domestic space will look like, and they're all so clean. And I think what you're maybe kind of getting at is a much messier interiority, and I think that could really be pushed, right? Like I think the scenes at the end, these kinds of hot tub doll houses almost are really interesting in a kind of, I think, just like really crowded interiors. And maybe they're interiors of the mind, to more going to kind of Joe Day's kind of talk about surrealism. But maybe they're literally what happens after you've built your boyfriend, then you have all this stuff left in your house. What do you do with it? Maybe the parts are a little bit bigger. Maybe they're not doll size. Maybe they're a little bit more awkward, right? And they get in the way of your room, and you're, you know, they're on your carpet, and you know, they end up under your bed. Like, I don't know, but there's something there that I think is actually maybe much more physical than it is virtual.
Hey everyone, I'm going to just call. I think I'm right? About time.
Thank you everyone for your comments.
Thank you.
Andrew, do you mind if I just make one final quick comment for Richard? Because I think just to quickly wrap up. Sorry, but Richard. I think it was great, and I think the comments are quite helpful. There's two things I would kind of say that are sort of undercurring some of the comments. Like, one is the sense that you started the thesis as a way to acknowledge that there are a variety of references out in the world that maybe architects don't look at, or artists don't always look at, and maybe as a queer person, you wanted to kind of bring them in. And a part of it would also kind of come into the sense that perhaps depending on the references you're looking at, different kinds of work may come out, and that there may or may not be an ability for all of us to always look at every reference, because we just don't have the sort of political lens to understand them all necessarily. So I think this question that Jason brings up about aesthetics is important, because by being able to sort of put all of it into the same aesthetic territory, it doesn't yet necessarily maybe acknowledge the fact that these are references coming from different kind of political or cultural kind of viewpoints, which is at least where you were starting some of your thesis. So I think that that's an important question. And in the sense of the building and the kind of designed object at the end, I would think that I mean, I don't know. I think that's definitely a good position to take, but I would ask that you, I think there needs to be more resistance, I suppose, in some of it, like in some of the abilities of what can happen, like like producing these like weird design landscape objects, I think is incredible. I think the question might be like, why is it sort of producing that? And maybe that would get to some of Andrew's questions of like, why wouldn't it produce a building, or why wouldn't it produce a city? And some of those references might produce a city and some might not. I think that would be really cool to sort of build on. But as a video, I think it was a really great first pass at like taking a month of work that was kind of all over the place and figuring out how to at least make some sense of it. So congratulations. And sorry, I don't want to take too much more time.
No, that's fantastic. Great. We're going to move now to Zoe.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Zoe. Let me share my screen. All right. So my project is called Tremulous. If you drive along the 10 East Freeway in the mid to late afternoon, you'll see this building shimmering on the downtown LA skyline. Undoubtedly, William Pereira, don't think intended to make a magical building, but it introduced me to a category of architecture where there is a discrepancy between the object of the building and its atmospheric effect. And I liken this project a lot to Seurat's paintings, particularly A Sunday Afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. And here in the bottom left corner is the full painting, but I've zoomed in on it, and this painting, like from far away, the image, all the colors and the dots and the pointillism coalesce into one image. But when you get close up, you can see how all the little pieces that it's made out of. So it's all the paint strokes are creating this atmospheric effect. On the other side of the 10 freeway from this shimmering building is the Los Angeles Metropolitan Courthouse, which is the site for my project. This courthouse houses LA's traffic court. It's also where mental health issues are dealt with, and some of the juvenile court cases are handled here, and then some lower level criminal cases. So, like the bigger crimes are handled on the other side of downtown LA. But this is where most people would end up going if you needed to pay for a traffic ticket or contest it. And actually the building has pretty horrible Yelp reviews. First photo was right after it was built, and this is how it looks now. I'm gonna take a little segue and show you some videos quickly. So these are some early experiments I've been working with. And this is my miniature model. So as you can see, you know, it's one model with two hats right now. And the bottom portion is the courthouse to scale, and it's now twice as tall because this courthouse is it's a little short and frumpy, and I want to explore how a tremulous effect in the urban landscape of downtown LA and how it's perceived and how it's orchestrated and perceived from the freeway and how it's perceived from close up. And also for this courthouse, you know, I've seen a lot of photos with people waiting in line outside in the hot sun. So trying to negotiate and solve some of those environmental problems as well. And another thing is been exploring the color beige. If you drive around LA, it's very beige and gray. And like, you know, LAUSD, all the Department of Water and Power buildings, they're all just this beige color. So I want to play with something, again, like the Seurat painting, maybe looks beige from far away, but as you approach it, you can see that it breaks down into all of this color. So yeah, I'm going to take the Los Angeles Metropolitan Courthouse, which is slated for a critical need renovation, and create this large urban effect through a tremulous or a shimmer, and then also exploring the use of color with it.
I know that building a little too well.
Mm-hmm.
I've been both. I've both had my own traffic violation issues there and been impaneled on a jury there. It's a horrible place.
Yeah, that's what everyone says. I've actually been there once before myself, and not so great.
I literally got myself to the end of 2 hour-and-a-half Kafkaesque lines on the parking violation and said, "Tell me what I have to write this check for to never return to this building." And that was that. But so, you know, kudos for taking on what is, you know, it's interesting. It's probably the most kind of Soviet building in Los Angeles in a lot of respects. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question would be, just at this stage, taking the monolithic and end capped kind of existing composition you're dealing with, and setting up this kind of this two-part composition with I guess I'm not yet completely won over to how the secondary volume will relate to the primary one. And it might be, honestly, I feel like perhaps in a spin I could be easily convinced, but that relationship seems important, and I'm not totally clear on it yet.
Right. That's something I'm still trying to figure out, but some of the thoughts right now are creating like a shaded rooftop garden, or even kind of flipping the way the circulation currently works. So instead of having to wait in a line on the ground floor outside of the building, you could move all the way up and be in this higher shaded area. I'm also realizing I had some more photos of my model. I totally forgot to flip through them, so sorry about that.
I think you've set up a really nice problem for your, I feel like your project has a clear and kind of concise scope to it, mm-hmm. and it makes good sense. I would take that building more radically to task.
Mm. Thank you, Joe. That's a good suggestion.
So is your reinterpretation of the courthouse supposed to be in conversation with the existing USC tower? Or are you using that more as inspiration to create this kind of pixel effect or whatever?
Yeah, I think I'm using it more in conversation, and then in terms of choosing the site, knew I wanted to do a courthouse, and particularly one that needed to be renovated or a new one that was going to be built. So it kind of felt a little bit like Kismet, that it was almost a mirror image from the 10 freeway. Since I in other classes too, I've been exploring the shimmering effect of this building.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting how you're, like the comment you made that everything in LA is very tan and very gray, and that you want to study kind of how you can use that effect to take color and influence from the Seurat painting into, you know, manipulating the facade so that it appears one way far away, maybe on the freeway, but up close, maybe you kind of explore the relationship of the person who's waiting in line and to the person who's driving up to it, and how those kind of different relationships are created through however you design the facade or whatever to create that kind of colored effect. Because you're almost doing like a little bit of the opposite of the Seurat painting, where that one's still very, even though it's composed of a lot of different pixelated colors, it still is very colorful painting in itself, where you're almost trying to use color to be devoid of color.
Right.
So I think that's kind of interesting, but something that is just a little bit lacking from your study models and stuff. There's not really any like color theory studies of how you'd actually be able to accomplish that yet. So I would definitely pursue more of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. That's what's up next.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked some of your descriptions of this. You described the shimmering as magic, and then you described magic as discrepancy, which I think is a really great description of magic. And this word discrepancy brings a lot onto the table, I think. I think that maybe it has to do with the tectonics of this building, but I feel that, you know, there is something really interesting in the idea that it would seem to be one thing but operator, or that, you know, like, I don't really think that magic is about getting closer, although you could make that argument, right? That if you get close enough, then you can see the strings and the trap doors and the whatever. But maybe it's less about a kind of zooming in and zooming out, and more about really, really careful tricks, right? Like tricks that even if you zoomed in, they still kind of hold up. And so I don't know what that means. I mean, it's just something that I think is interesting. So I don't know, I would kind of follow that a little bit more, and maybe take your kind of reading of that building, like of that kind of magical building, a little bit more literally, because I don't think it's just like a gut reaction. I think there's something there that's probably at work that you kind of don't believe in, as in like looking at it as an architect, right? And so I don't know, I would kind of chase that a little bit.
Cool, yeah, and oh, just one thing on your point, Deborah, is that this is a building that, you know, back when we had school at SCI-Arc, this is on my commute. And like, this is a building I would see every single day. And on the one day I happened to drive to school in the afternoon is when I found this magic effect. And just kind of, you know, being a morning person, but trying to find some opportunities to go to school in the afternoon to experience it again. And just, you know, every single time, like, it just, for me, it just hasn't been getting old.
I just wanted to, I mean, I completely agree with everything Deborah just said. And I too am intrigued by the problem that arises between the kind of natural friction between, let's say in your case, a shimmer effect, which is a large scale kind of macro thing, versus the individual pixels, whatever they may be. It looked like they were triangular shingles in your case, but it could be any kind of very small pigmented object. But the tension between those individual units, which are very micro in scale, and the effects that they produce, which tend to be macro, how one then, I mean, what Deborah was saying that like so struck my interest, and I don't know if it's actually your interest, how, so then do you care at all to worry about, let's say, detailing those shingles? If really I only cared how they looked from, 1,000 yards away, or, from far away? Or do you actually, are you responsible for somehow creating these little pixels such that when one got close to them, there was something there? I mean, I don't know. This is an unanswered question in my mind, but it's one that I happen to be working through currently. And so I saw that. I saw that just like Deborah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
I don't know. The way I could wrap up that comment is between the micro kind of shimmer stuff on the outside and the bigger macro kind of posturing and massing stuff. I wasn't seeing it.
right. Sorry, Jason, you cut out a little bit, but I think I got most of what you were saying. And yeah, I think you're right that, for now, haven't quite made that decision yet of, and actually, I think Andrew and I talked about this first week is, am I going to do like details of the tectonic system and like detailed spec drawings, or kind of focus more on how it appears from the distance? And I think something I'm still trying to figure out and want to focus on is how to orchestrate the effects, and especially how to do that now that it seems like our final is going to be over Zoom and things like that.
If I could, I'm going to throw something in. Yeah, I think, your setup of your project is great. I think what everyone, myself included, and you want to see is the actual,
Mm-hmm.
I know in the Seurat, there's a reading that I know on Jonathan Crary on Seurat, discussing scales of coherence of the color, and from a distance it having a kind of overall kind of blah, and at a correct distance it snaps into its appropriate colors, and then at a close distance it disappears and falls apart into a series of separate shades. And especially if that upper piece is occupied, you've set it up exactly a project where you see those three kinds of scales. And I think now you just have to do it.
Yep.
I just ask a quick question, because I would, that's a really great, I'm gonna have to read that essay by Jonathan Crary, but I had a similar question based on like both something Deborah and Jason were saying, and I was curious about the hat and like why it has like hard edges, and why it's so like kind of singular in a way, like as a thing. I was just thinking about maybe other architects that have thought about kind of pointillist-ish facades, and how those things, what the effects of those are in relationship to what the effect of yours might be, and in particular to the building across the way. One thing that I noticed in the Seurat is that in the zoom in, even though you can see all of the individualized pixels, you're starting to kind of get somewhere where you're getting not just the one color, even though they sort of muddle themselves, but you're starting to get other figures that have started to kind of come in a little bit. And when you zoom back out, obviously the picture is a picture of many figures, of perspective, of like different kinds of compositional things that come together. And I'm curious about like what the sort of work with like a singular mass and like a singular object that sort of produces that gets enveloped with these things would be in relationship to the study in Seurat, where at least there's a kind of slight differentiation within the zoom in, and then some sort of extreme differentiation of like producing senses of edges that are not actually there in the kind of zoom out in the full picture. And so like, I'm just curious about like the sense of geometry in relationship to these things, and whether like if you think of, I don't know, the building that came to my mind was like Herzog and Demeron at the De Young Museum, by kind of pixelating things and letting them fade at the edges to never actually, or wrap across a piece of geometry, so that like, let's say a fold in geometry is almost kind of masked or never quite confronted with the pixels themselves. They sort of have, they can kind of go anywhere and not exactly match up, or at least end on an edge themselves. And I'd be curious about like, I mean, there's other examples, I'm sure, but about how you think of those edges and to think of like the singular masked figure in relationship to if it should be thought of as like the frame of the painting, or it should be thought of as one of the figures inside of a painting in a sense. And I think that overall it makes the building a figure in the city more than it makes the content of the pixels a kind of painting, and that thing seems like the frame of the edge of it. But then I'm a little bit curious about like, you know, would these pixels become three-dimensional and kind of produce like fuzzy edges? Is it always like a super flat thing with like a super even line at all zoom levels? The further away you get, does it get somehow blurrier? Or when you get closer, do those edges get crisper? I don't know, those things I think to me get kind of exciting.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, David. And one thing, yeah, I have been thinking about, and Andrew and I have been talking about is, yeah, does it soften at the edges? Do the pixels kind of like fall away a little bit so you don't see a hard edge? I mean, I think in terms of the massing and it having the hard edges, trying a little bit to use some of the language of the existing building. But I think those are really interesting questions that you bring up, and I want to explore those more.
Maybe David, is a good time to.
My timer just went off. So yes, it's a perfect time.
Perfect.
Great,
Thank
thank
you.
you everyone.
Thank you. Fatima, are you ready to take the show?
Hello everyone, my name is Fatima, and my project is in a city in Iran called Isfahan. Let me first I just explain a little bit about the city. Isfahan is a historical city in the middle of Iran, divided into two parts by the Zayan River. There is a main axis that begins in the older part of the city at Jame Mosque, and then runs through Isfahan Bazaar, and then continue to Naqsh Jahan Square. Then by Charbagh Street is reached the river. There is a bridge called Allah Berdi Khan that connects this historical access to the new southern part of the city. This project is a multi-program slab tower in the south and Isfahan, acting as a terminus to the historical axis. It explores the potential of combining small individual spaces, similar in character to the platform found in Jame Mosque, but arranged into two sections in order to create new supercomponents. Through this project seeks a relationship amongst individual users, the aggregation of spaces, and their connection to urban space. These render shows the reacting and behavior of light and shadow through each small spaces in section of this building. The other thing that is interesting for me is a connection that happened in the historical bridge in Isfahan. Two facades, thick facade, connect with one slab. These facades kind of connect people to the urban space, like this this bridge, you can see two different facades that connect together with the slabs. And this is the circulation diagram of circulation of bridges that I will use for my project. And this is a part of historical place. This is my miniature model. Let's see. That you can see all small spaces. And unfortunately, because it has two different sides, and I don't have the other side, I don't just render the other side of the project. This is gonna be one thin mixed-use building that offers a new typology and building form for the historical city Isfahan.
Fatima, is that the, oh, okay. Just for a point of clarification, is this meant to be a vertically oriented like mass in the city?
Yes.
Like as we saw it? Okay, thanks.
Can you go back? You didn't explain that part very clearly, Fatima. Can you go back to one of your first couple of slides?
Yes, sure.
It's a slab tower.
Yeah.
Right. So it's taking these plans of these existing buildings, kind of reconfiguring them in these beautiful compositions and then rotating it upwards.
Backwards?
Yes.
Go back more. Keep going. No. Keep going. There. Wait. Forward. Well, that's a 90-degree axle of your tower.
Yeah.
At the bottom.
Yeah, here.
Okay.
Oh, that. Oh,
Place
okay, got it.
the tower. This is a site, but it's in plan.
But that's a 90-degree axle of elevation. There you go. Okay.
And the building above it in this city map is in plan. Yes, that's not a building. That's like a
put an
town square.
elevation of a slab onto the plan.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
But is the other building also an elevation?
No, these are plan.
Okay, got it. Okay.
You can. Thank you.
So is the modern part of the city on the side of the bridge where you're showing your new vertical tower, and then the old part of the city is where the existing mosque that you're taking inspiration from?
Yes.
Or, okay.
It is kind of the project is going to be the first and the maybe entrance point for the modern part of the city, because the old part is just finished at the end of the bridge. And then the modern part of the city start with maybe this project, we can say.
Okay. Well, I think something interesting, like you mentioned how vertically, like you're kind of looking how light portals can kind of come in through this kind of slab, because like traditionally lawn buildings, they're going to block views. Like I think we're all very familiar with one Santa Fe, and they call that in Boyle Heights the Berlin Wall. So I think like you could also consider that, like, are you trying to block off old city from new city, or are you creating some sort of invitation, and are these light perforations going to be so porous that you're able to make that connection still more of a way that's just horizontally traveling, but also through something more vertical, and how you can kind of create those connections between old and new?
This building is not gonna block the connection between two parts of the city, because it kind of the side of the bridge, because the bridge is exactly the middle. You can see the middle part, but it's a side. This is not gonna not block the city or a view of the city, because you can see on top of the bridge, you can see the other side of the city. It's not gonna block. You can see the building, but it's not block the whole view.
Yeah, so if you're, what I'm saying is like, not if you're in the building, but if you're like in a house that's a few blocks away, are you then no longer going to have a nice view of your mosque that you go to all the time and stuff, like being able to maintain that porosity?
Yes.
So you showed some images, like photos of a physical model that you made, right? And then you showed renders.
Yeah.
First of all, I mean, it was just very strange to see a model. I feel like I haven't seen a model in months. I'm like, what is that? What is that thing? That's a model. I feel like, you know, like the model is like this like weird thing from like the time before we were all on the screen. So it was like very weird and kind of nice to see a model. But then my question would be, your renders also had a kind of reminiscence of the model. Like they're, and again, right, we're at the beginning, like we're not at a, you know, we're not maybe having a conversation about material or even color just yet. So that would be one thing that I would maybe begin to think about, like these plans that you sort of show and the kind of work that you're doing of putting these plans together also kind of have a materiality to them and a kind of texture that belongs to the drawing, right, more than it does to the model. And so I guess one question that I would have for you is there an interest at all in a kind of translation of drawing materiality, I guess, or like the drawing to a kind of materiality where line and shading and these kinds of things begin to kind of become something else as we move forward?
Not yet about the material, because I was thinking that this building gonna be, some part of the building is gonna be open to the outside. This look like there's like a whole thing. So about the material, I'm not still sure. And yeah, I'm thinking about that for.
Yeah, just because I think that maybe there's a possibility there, right, in which you are working with not even like redrawn plans, you're working with the drawings of the plans. And I think that's a really important kind of distinction and something to take control of, right, to kind of intentionally take control of as a designer. And that might be the way that we always talk about porosity, and I think that porosity can be defined in a lot of ways, and there's something there, I would say, like material, and maybe even not even talking about the model as a version of the building, but you know, now that we've moved into this kind of virtual world, we have to kind of begin to redefine this word model, because we're still going to be making models. We're always making models. If you made a building, I would be incredibly like surprised and like in total, you know, like mad respect if you know, but like you're still gonna be making models, right? So that would just be one thing that I would put on the table, is as you continue to work on these models and think about their materiality, which will be in the realm of the render and in the realm of representation, I would not let those things sort of, you know, slide away from you, and sort of take control of those kind of early on.
I think also you spoke about how in the existing building, there's a lot of communal spaces. There's a lot of like different ways that you have different processions through that kind of space. And so I think it would be interesting if you could look at how you do transform that vertically, and how you also switch that from different programmings of being a more sacred religious space to being a more multi-use space, and how you create different versions of circulations throughout a vertical form that maintain that same sort of procession as well, possibly, especially if it is going to be like a transitional space between old and new. Like, how can you maintain some of the old cultural kind of artifacts and transition them into a more contemporary life? And I know that sounds very vague, but I think it could be an interesting thing to kind of ponder on.
I mean, to me, Abigail, that seems like the central challenge of the project at this point. I mean, that 90-degree rotation and how you resolve it. I feel like the model you have now does a really elegant job of making the case for that kind of distillation and pivot in terms of the scale of apertures and space, and actually the play between what I read as apertures and what may or may not be spaces beyond or involved with those apertures, I think is a really nice ambiguity of the model at this stage. But I do think in the time you've got remaining, taking up, even if you only kind of isolate a few places where you kind of make sense of that horizontal to vertical transition, and especially that whether it's kind of, I'm interested in the pivoting of possibly sacred spaces in that urban mix to begin with, but just any scalar variety within them will make different demands on you as you make that turn. I mean, I think the general premise of your thesis, the idea that an urban logic, that a building can sort of be sampled and remodified and importantly rotated out of urbanism is literally becoming architecture in your scheme very directly and through a set of really deliberate maneuvers. And I would be more, I guess actually, you may want to keep that more sleight of hand, but personally, I'd be more interested in you being really clear about this, how those steps play.
As Deborah was speaking and actually Joe, you were speaking, it was sort of two different things, one about the kind of model and one about urbanism. The thing that I was thinking as I was listening to those comments was the images that you have that I suppose you made of the reconfiguration, they look like they're from scans of plans or like images of plans, like they're before you maybe trace them with vectors or something like this. And so there's like a blurriness to them that is really quite beautiful, and they feel like a drawing. And I would suspect that the idea of going from plan to section might take on this question that I think Deborah brings up of maybe even taking that thing quite literally. And I'd be kind of curious about that blurriness that happens at some of those edges, that, the black blurs into the white ever so slightly, and what that would mean for kind of a section for an urban building. I think it relates a little bit to some of those plan diagrams that you show of like these spaces one can walk through that even though they're black and white, one would assume the sense of privacy is a little bit blurry in them. I think that taking that drawing a little bit more literally and actually seeing, I don't know how you make a blur once you have to make a model out of what that looked like foam or like when you mill it or something, whatever it was, or maybe you made it a different way. But I'd be curious about that. Like if you had to zoom into a part of it and actually start to see not just like a surface effect, but a sense of like these spaces or the city having like a strong figure like it is, and yet at a sort of micro level, things not being so distinctly always black and white or solid and void, etc. That there's something in that drawing that would be actually quite literalized as it moves into architecture. I think would be kind of interesting. And I don't know exactly how it addresses Joe's question on urbanism and as it moves into section, but I think that would be pretty interesting.
Thank you.
I'm just going to suggest in the future, Fatima, you should just not mention the mosque.
Okay.
I think it gets consumed. Those bridges, it's amazing. I've loved those bridges of Isfahan for a long time. And it turns out Fatima worked on historic buildings in Isfahan for a number of years before coming to SCI-Arc, so she knows them intimately. But there are these kinds of public spaces, these various cells that you can move through and hang out in various activities. And so in a sense, and I think there's a question of what the back of the slab is, whether it's a normative building or whether it goes deep. but that the facade itself, like a giant ant farm, is going to become like a gigantic public space that one moves through. And that, as I understand it, which I didn't realize, there's like, Isfahan is extremely low, that this would be, the city fathers would have a collective heart attack at the thought of a building like this. And so this idea of it's floating like this specter on the other side of the river would be a kind of, I guess there's a kind of politics to it that you articulate very well when we talk about it. And I think you can talk through these things, I think, a little better, including your knowledge, your intimate knowledge of the city.
All right, are there any final comments? Okay, I think maybe we're ready to move on. Thank you, Fatima. Andrew, who's next in our lineup?
This is the 1-2 punch, Yi Yang and CU. You guys ready?
Yeah, we're ready. Okay. Hello, everyone. Let me share the screen with you. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, you can see that. Okay, so our project is Mad Complex. First, we're gonna talk about our site analysis. Well, the site choice, the Piggy Backyard, which is located in downtown LA. It's like the north part of SCI-Arc, right next to the Union Station. And it was surrounded by 4 totally different function areas in the city. And the entire site was cut through by 2 highways. So it's quite a challenging site for us to design. This is where it is. You can see the Union Station on the left and the residential space on the right. Beneath it was SCI-Arc, and alongside the LA River, and the northern part was the railway service facilities. So it was a project was designed before by AE companies. They will propose a site upgrade program in this area. What we're gonna do is to doing a upgrade, like doing a housing designs to this site. And we'd like to try to use the MAT buildings, MAT housing ideas to try to test how the interconnections of the city's designs can combine with building designs. So MAT Complex, this is our model for miniature. We were trying to overlap massings above our site and to use the inner connections and the MAT housing logic to connect the different parts, and using the load graders and inner corridor connections to test out the MAT housing systems in LA downtown system in the urban context. So this is what it looks like on the side plans, and the 3-layer MAT systems, it was overlapping one above each other, and to construct to the residential, commercial, and different use of the buildings. And this was the inner connection circulation corridors.
And also we are trying to figure out some detailed housing research and study. Things like each unit is very important for the MAT building. So what we did is we find two very different significant housing units, and one of each is designed by Miss Pendrew in Chicago, and the other one is the China Wharf in London. And we try to transfer 2 different units from one to another gradually to see if there is any possibility for new typology. And you can see the result is quite fascinating and brings some new ideas about housing. So for now, we are still working on the overall site plan, checking if the housing units, each of the housing units is workable to our project.
And for the traditional MAT building housing, the idea was to using kind of very flat designs, 1 layer above each layers. For us, we would like to try combine with some of Adolf Loos's round plan ideas to try test the housing unit, if we can doing it like a space plan, but not just a cube above the other 2 cubes. Combine those ideas, make a special MAT complex. That will be the key point of this project. Yep, that's it.
I've got a question about the word matte or matteness. Is matteness the perception of matte to achieve at the large scale like we're looking at here? Or does matteness have something to do with much more interior scale, smaller scale, what environments or formal arrangements or something? What is matte? Where really is the focus here for you two on creating a matte that is clearly a matte?
Okay, so first of all, matte building, this site is a really huge site. It's about like 400 meters by 400 meters, very huge scale. We don't want to like design a vertical, like stacking, like super high rise for a very large amount of residentials. So matte, this would be the one consider for trying to use the matte appearances. The other consideration is matte buildings, it kind of fits the LA housing idea, which is the high density but the low rise. We'd like to try to use, but there's not so many matte systems in LA, especially in downtown, seeing such a high-rise complex like site around there. So we'd like to try to use a different language in this area to. It's more focused on the forms and the entire site arrangement.
Yeah, I think like your intro to your presentation and the title of your thesis leads like us to believe that it's more about the matteness. But then it seemed at the end that what you got really excited about was actually the composition of the units and how you can study the Rond-Point and like do different studies of them interlocking to kind of see like how these units can come together. I think maybe what's missing is what is the end goal of those units to create the matte? Like, you know, is it about efficiency or is it about circulation and public space, or, you know, like what's kind of driving the organization of the overall matte, and how these units that you are so interested in studying on, you know, how to create these units, how these come together to create this matte. Because right now it just seems kind of like, you know, there's a large site, we put it around, we did this. But I think there needs to be more of an overarching kind of logic or kind of some rules or something that you set with these units, or maybe you need to decide where you want to focus the project. Maybe it's more about the matte, maybe it's more about the actual individual units themselves and how you can make, like, you know, the experience of the person living in this unit within this overall matte project. Like, how do you make that the best kind of experience or whatever, or create a new type of topology, or like what's your end, you know, goal, I guess.
I think I'm a little curious on this one, and I think actually the format of this review may not serve it well in terms of the idea of a maquette standing in for the thesis in a way, at this stage. I think in your project that has to be something kind of extracted from a larger kind of field condition argument for how you're going to deal with that, with what is a really nebulous stretch of urban space along the river. I guess I have less a question than maybe just a thought that a few years ago, Tom Main was doing these really strange, interesting model drawing things that, Andrew, do you know the ones I'm talking about? They usually were in the end kind of circular in form, big circles, and they transposed two cities. So the title of each one was a portmanteau of two hybridized.
It's his like combinatory drawings.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess, I mean, just as a, I don't know if those are useful here or actually just get in the way, but I do feel like that's the last time I looked at, I saw kind of, well, the last project we looked at was kind of urbanism into architecture as well, but that, you know, I thought that attempt to look at something beyond kind of palimpsest layering and look instead for kind of stranger, more variable, three-dimensional superimposition was doing something I hadn't seen before. And, you know, I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I'd be curious what the two of you make of that body of work and if it has any relation to yours.
They went deep into Giancarlo Di Carlo so far.
That might be a better place to go.
Which I made him go do because I thought, when was the last time someone brought up Giancarlo Di Carlo at SCI-Arc? That last thing that you guys showed, that's one example of another. I mean, they were taking things like the Marseille block and another thing, two sections of two completely different plan organizations and working through a series of smooth transformations as a continuous block. And so I think somewhere, if the mat buildings we think of as made out of kind of Lego pieces, their goal is that within it, there's a kind of odd sliding spectrum where the housing types maybe don't even have names anymore. 6 bedrooms and no bathrooms and 2 kitchens next to each other with another thing sliding past it, another thing up above. And I think that's the sort of promise. And I'm going to guess the model as we saw it is a kind of armature to organize what will really be the housing experiment of the project.
I got the feeling that was the like smaller scale, that final rendering you show was a little bit more developed. It had like a clear sense of where it was heading. And I wonder if it needs to continue to be something that is also worked at as an urban, like a larger urban mat building proposal, or if it would be more about this kind of building that's also a street at the same time and multiple kinds of urban, or I'm sorry, like dwelling units. But operates almost like a building in a street and a street would operate if you had to put them together at the same time. Like that's how I read that final image, and it was very different to me than the sense of a mat building. And I think Jason's question of what is matness to you is an interesting one, because if I understand Jason's question correctly, is the suggestion that that could be at a different scale, for example. But I don't know, like the final image where it's really kind of looking at a smaller scale thing might be somewhere to push a little bit further and then ask what does it mean as it propagates a little bit larger and perhaps it's not necessarily a kind of map building as one knows it, where it's, you know, gridded in some sense and rectangular and has fuzzy edges, but instead might take on a slightly different kind of form as it gets larger. But there's something at that scale that seems super interesting. Like there would be an internal street. There's two things that seems like opposing systems that were somehow going through one another, and yet they seem totally both against one another, but seem like in that image to be able to coexist, which seemed super interesting as a dwelling proposal. I wasn't so clear how that would influence the bigger scale, but I think that would be kind of interesting, is to sort of ask what that would sort of do at a bigger scale.
In my mind, it always would be pointing towards some kind of complicated woven blanket, you know, where outdoor space also becomes part of it. I mean, you know, like it was funny when they showed me the black and white of the mat building. I said, you're like completely channeled like 1963. How did you? Northern Europe, 1963, that's great. And it's funny, they can do that, but I have a feeling the final mat is going to have more to do with extrapolations from the logic of the housing you develop rather than a print that you have ahead of time. which will then be its kind of matness, because in a certain way, that's a kind of mat logic that it's put together out of units. There's just these weird fuzzy units instead of Lego blocks.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Anyway, how I.
Yeah. I think it could be some interesting thing, like riffing off of how you're talking, kind of like a city within a city where streets are going through, and maybe it is some sort of more communal living where you don't have a kitchen inside and you're kind of creating this kind of like really large commune and like a new typology of housing almost.
Yeah, or even like 30 different types all mixed together, you know?
Yeah.
The fortress, you know, the single person's pad, the, you know, the commune.
Maybe a hostel, who knows, like
yeah.
whatever people want.
You just let the architectural maneuver generate new possibilities of usage. I think that's what's interesting about that last diagram.
Mm-hmm.
That was the shortest presentation you two have ever made. They usually have their footnotes and their. Okay.
Great. Well, any other comments? Cool. Well, seems great. I guess we can move on maybe to the next project, which is I think Kayun.
Yes.
Okay.
He's he's in a swimming pool.
He's in this. I see that. Yeah.
Very refreshing.
But not the Nirvana cover, a different one.
No.
It looks like.
Hi. Good afternoon. I'm Kayun, and I'm going to share the screen. My project is about design of opera house. This project consists of 3 theaters: a grand theater, a multifunctional theater, and a music hall. Normally, the presentation of opera house is often limited by time and space. So I'm aiming to break the limitation of the opera in this project. I hope that when people enjoy opera in an opera house, they can experience it continuously, just like watching a movie. So as you can see, the 3 theaters are connected by a huge ring. And this ring is a big revolving stage shared by the 3 different theaters. The red cubes in the ring are stage lifting system. Traditional stage also have the same device, but in this case, due to the very big size of the stage, this system can simulate the different scenes. Here are 3 sections of the 3 theaters. So when the circular stage does not need to rotate it, all these 3 theaters can play their traditional project as they did. And when the stage rotates, people can enjoy the same opera in 3 different theaters at the same time. And the scene switching during the performance will not interrupt by the development of the story. So this is how I try to free the limitation of the opera. And I hope that an opera house with a ring stage can provide more possibilities for the performance of opera and the way people enjoy opera. That's it.
Kayun, are you going to talk about what the project is, where it is, and
this project is in a beach.
But you have a whole presentation of that. Where is it?
In the
the site.
Can you see it?
Yeah, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
The orange area is the site. Is in the North China. Is in Shenzhen, and as you can see, the opposite place of the site is Hong Kong. So the nature environment is very good, and sometimes the ship across the site, and they can see the buildings.
Why do you?
Sorry.
Why do you think they're putting the opera house there?
Because maybe I think personally I think the government want to show off. They want a very significant special opera house to show the power. And actually, the site is in China, so I don't really think many people would like to watch opera because there are not much people even interested in the Chinese traditional opera. But why I don't introduce the site is because I am trying to provide a new typology of an opera house. So the site might not that important. And that's it.
Thank you.
So the performers are on the red cubes and you sit inside the cube that rotates around, or is it vice versa? Or the performers are inside each of the cubes that travel around, and as you watch, you're standing on the red cubes?
The performers stand on the red cube, and it turns when we need. You don't have to turn always.
Okay.
What is mobile and what is fixed? Or is the red ring of performance?
The red ring it can move, and the black, all the black you can see is fixed, and actually only the red area are stages, and they can turn.
Would you mind putting? I have your aerial photo of this the distant site shot. Would you mind putting up an image of the prototype of the project?
Sorry.
Okay, hang on a second.
Sorry about that.
Wait,
I want to try to
share my screen for a second. Okay, can you explain this?
Got it. Okay.
Can you explain?
Okay. These are some ideas before. I hope the theater can. It's the first task of the theater can play the traditional opera as a traditional grand theater, and the second one of the task is I don't want the opera stop or interrupt by the changing the scenes. So I hope the stage can continually running. So they just move to another area and the new scenes come. So it's like playing the game of Super Mario. And the third one is immersive theater. I inspired by the opera, which name is Sleep No More. I don't know if you guys enjoyed it before. It's very special opera. There's no opera house, just an old building, and the audience has no seat. They stand in the stage, and they can stand very close to the performers and see what's happening. It's very special show. So I'm thinking maybe the people can also step into the stage and to watch the opera.
Is that clear, Joe?
Yeah, and I'm super sympathetic to this project, Andrew. I really want to try. I want to.
Me too.
I want it to work. Honestly, I think. I'm guessing that you're familiar with Walter Gropius's Total Theater as a precedent, and I think what you're headed in a lot of interesting directions, and I think you need to systematize your. Actually, I hesitate to say systematize, because I think you may like systems a little more than you want to here, but I think you need to develop a clear logic, both of the play between the performative ring and these modules of the kind of modular audience spaces and backstage spaces that kind of track around that ring. And perhaps, and I would suggest, like, if you've got 3 of them, I like your big one, but I would suggest looking at how they could combine with one another, because at some point, you know, I guess if those are fixed, then the ring is sort of moving amongst them, but you could do the opposite and look at those audience and backstage modules as something that move around in terms of one another. I mean, I think this could be a really, really fascinating project, but I think you've got to you've got to make some strong categorical decisions about how you're going to vary the scale and kind of experiential character of the 3 different kinds of operatic performance you're imagining. That diagram we were just looking at clarifies your ambitions, but it doesn't tell me much about how those 3 different circumstances could be achieved and how they could kind of reinforce one another.
Right. And here's a thought on that. And I don't know, seems right to me, but I'm sure it could be challenged. It seems to me that you could rely an awful lot on just raw juxtaposition in a project like this, where, you know, as the part of the building that is moving kind of locks into whatever of the 3 theater spaces it does, that in my imagination, there's enough in just the weird juxtaposition of being kind of in one relationship to a theater at one time, and in some other time being in the same seats, I'm assuming, or in the same, somehow in the same space, but now related to a very different theater experience and structure. Like, it seems to me, this is where, you know, maybe there would be people that would differ, but in this case, it seems like I would try to leave I'm talking about like expression now, like formal and spatial expression. My tendency would be to leave it kind of raw instead of, I don't know, trying to, my first impulse would not be to somehow think I had to emphasize difference in relation, because clearly there's going to be radical difference no matter what. So I don't know. My imagination for this building is more of a crude, like a blunt object in a way. Again, I don't know, no idea if anyone else imagines it that way, and there would be multiple ways to imagine it, but somehow that's, especially with those diagrams, which I found super compelling. The building itself for that raw and kind of unburdened with feeling like it needs to gesture somehow outwardly. It's my 2 cents.
I think, like, riffing on that, because the experience of the person actually being inside the theater, they have no experience with the urban context really. And so it does become very like an insular kind of object. Because if all the backstage is wrapped around where the performers are, then essentially you're going to be like in kind of just this big black ring. So I think you could really, oh, I'm sorry, I dropped my phone. I think you could really think about, like, what does this look like architecturally, and how does this transform from, you know, our typical type of theater, what those typically look like. Usually they have like large promenades, and they're, you know, they are enclosed insular spaces that don't have windows and stuff like that, but they do have large kind of gathering areas that typically have a lot of light. So how do you kind of bring that inward to the center of this ring and then bring people up? How do you change that kind of organization?
Yeah, I wonder to Abigail's point, if just looking at the building in terms of both its centripetal and centrifugal possibilities, I think you've got everybody coming in the hole of the donut and then going up into these kind of podular theater spaces looking into the performative ring. but I wonder if periodically that could reverse. I mean, it seems like you're kind of building a theater in the round, whether you want to or not, and getting it to work both ways would, I think, challenge. Right now it feels a little bit like it's lapsed into too much of a technical problem of how you get the theaters to run around the ring or the ring to circle through the theaters. And I think it ought to be more than that. And I think if you set up different scenarios where you're using the whole complex and looking inward to a theater in the round, or animating the ring in a different way, getting performance and audience to flip locations and roles would help, I think.
Yeah, there's something really kind of compelling here about attention. I think that the scrolling kind of entertainment is not so different from, like, you know, being on a phone and like scrolling. Like, our attention spans are very short. And you sort of mentioned at some point, like, some people don't even like opera, right? Which I think is kind of just like a interesting statement to just when you're designing an opera house. But the first thing that popped into my head was Jurassic Park, right? And there's a scene in Jurassic Park where they get on this, like, they're in a little theater and the theater moves and it like shows them what Jurassic Park is about. And not even 5 minutes have gone by and the audience has literally broken out of the machine and they've invaded the park and they want to know what's happening behind the closed doors, right? And behind all the kind of shiny parts. And it's this like great moment where you just sort of, you know, the audience is going to combat the machine, right? And if we want to even read it in a less combative tone, what if you get bored? What if you want to get off the ride? What if, you know, and so I would say that to Joe's point about these things sometimes maybe even converging or creating other organizations, there's maybe a possibility to begin to mine away at the circle. I think the circle is a little, I would begin to think about different kinds of loops or different kinds of pathways that maybe it is a circle in the end, right? We're talking about it like time in relation to what it means to watch a kind of finite performance. You know, does the loop kind of wrap on itself? Is it more of a knot rather than just the clean circle? A couple things that have to do more with what it means to watch stuff. Like, I think that might just be an interesting thing to investigate. The other thing is what this thing looks like, right? Again, the other reference is, you know, like Encounters of or whatever, every kind of UFO movie ever. I think I've just like been watching too many like alien things in quarantine, but this thing is just, you know, like parked and it's like glowing and everyone sees something, everyone has a different story from the outside, but even more interestingly, everyone's going to have a different story from the inside. And I think that's really interesting. Like, there's something about the inability to have one true story about this thing as a building. And so I don't know, I think maybe there's something there. Maybe it has to do with a couple of perspectives or views of the interior that have less to do with exposing this thing as a machine and more with having to do with what we see and what we communicate to the world of what we've seen, right? There might be something there about narrative, but yeah, Jurassic Park and UFOs.
Yeah, go for it.
No, I was going to say, Kayun is also the type of person who every time you meet, he has looks completely different. And like, I'd never seen the trusses. And so, you know, there's a certain kind of nerve to, you know, be able to work forward like that. And so I'm going to put the way it looks, I don't think that's one thing or the other right now. Probably too much of a Rube Goldberg contraption in terms of its appearance for my taste. But I think that notion that it's put facing Hong Kong and the history of its subservience economically and functionally to Hong Kong, and now its dramatic rise in wealth and the effort to kind of show that wealth with a form that really doesn't have to do with what something people want. It has more to do with what other cities that show their wealth make. And I think Kayun is very attuned to that there's something kind of as a kind of cultural bauble about it. Beijing does one, Shanghai does one, damn it. Shenzhen's gonna, gritty old Shenzhen is gonna do it as well. And so to imagine that there is the possibility of doing all of those traditional forms of theater that they ask for, but then do something where then, maybe you could actually do something maybe you would find interesting, and new kinds of operas could be written. Maybe this is where, even something as old at this point as Einstein on the Beach, would fit more comfortably into something like this. I think that's,
I mean, as you're saying that, Andrew, I was thinking like, if it is this, its presence in the city is important, and I don't know exactly what it, what it looks like in terms of like the skyline and the river and the mountains and everything. But I'd be curious if the thing is going to spin in this ring, if the roof itself would then therefore be like a kind of play of like, if it had like figures on it, for example, that were rotating around, it would already produce a sort of stage set at the scale of the city that regardless of whatever was happening inside, it would always somehow perform. And its figure and elevation becomes quite important in that sense. If there is something spinning and it's sort of facing between Hong Kong and China and is viewed in that way, I think that to me is the more exciting thing than like rethinking the stage. I think that rethinking the stage is great. We've seen lots of cool examples of it. I think your proposal is really great in that sense, but I like the sense that there could be a kind of internal theater and an external theater, an urban theater and a, let's say, more domestic theater, I suppose. But that I think is maybe where the question of the form and what it looks like actually becomes quite important. Which is what's the external sort of figure of this thing? If that's the plan of it and one part of it is spinning, I don't know, could be really incredibly exciting. And that would, to me, would be the next step as you kind of work out the plan. I think all the suggestions so far are really good. Does it need to be a circle? Is it the right scale of circle? Is the audience in the circle, in the ring, or not in the ring? But I think the other sort of kind of analysis is a sort of urban analysis of what that would be and what that means formally. As I was saying that, my timer went off, but if there are some final comments, please throw them in.
Just briefly, I've mentioned Gropius's total theater, but that's often contrasted with Kiesler's universal theater. Kiesler actually claimed earlier authorship of the total theater, but looking at the two of them together might be useful in terms of the architectonic character of the proposal, because whatever their similarities in terms of kind of diversifying different, in their cases, kind of cinematic encounters, theatrical encounters within these complex internal organizations, they're very, very differently realized as architect, in terms of their architectural presence. And it seems right now like he's pretty far down the Gropius technical, we're seeing the engineering, but there are other ways to kind of tackle that. There's also embedding it in something else, to David's point. If its exterior architecture is doing one thing anyway, sorry, Zoom is a punishing format. It's too easy to run on.
Keep going, Joe. Great. So I think we're going to move on to our final students. Priyanka?
Yeah. Hey.
Great.
My name's Priyanka, and I'll share my screen now. My project is called Blink Brink. The brink is an indication of fragile perception. It is a moment where the intermediate and mundane indicate moments of intrigue and interest. The neutrality of these intermediate spaces become the most dynamic locations as they resist setting into categories. The brink is a point of indifference or weakness that in turn enact difference or power, the potential of eventuality. So a series of diagrams that I have from now, looking at different characteristics that the brink or the threshold could bring about in my formal or spatial investigation. The first series of diagrams talks about circulation and different circulation paths that could possibly become part of the formal theories for my design. The second series of diagrams talks about parallax. Superimposition of axis and gridded spatial order produce ambiguity of spatial organization. This creates a sense of depth by perception due to overlap. This depth creates a misadventure, a craving for the unknown using a sense of parallax. These layers that are stacked on top of each other create spatial ambiguity by collapsing plan and elevation through juxtaposition of scale, projection, and rotation. This flattening of layers forms an intriguing formal and spatial quality. The next series of diagrams talks about materiality and facade detail that could be added to another layer of parallax. The brink is a liminal connection between inner and outer, an aperture that reveals a scene beyond, a scene within, an impermeable membrane of sorts. The last series of diagrams here talk about entrance quality and also ground condition. And these would be like different ground conditions that formally could play in my design. Applying all of these theories or diagrams to formal logics or spatial investigations, I have a series of diagrams that look at form in a two-dimensional aspect, which collapse plan and elevation. And I also did a series of model studies using all of these theories that I looked into. And this was my model for miniatures. So the Science program would look into, the program would be a charter school. The charter school or like certain organizations in Chicago, like the Chicago International Charter School or Illinois Network of Charter Schools, these organizations advocate for the improvement of public education by leveraging the charter school model as a catalyst to transform communities. They engage a diverse coalition of policymakers, school leaders, and community members to create systemic change for minorities in the city. So the site would be near the University of Illinois Chicago campus. The school was actually built in 2015 by looking for renovation, and I thought I could help with developing that. Thank you.
So is the goal of collapsing plan and elevation together, was that just a methodology you used to create the diagrams, or is the point to have plan and elevation be the same for the models? Because it almost looked like they were very similar, but it's hard to tell.
It would be very similar, but they wouldn't be the same. The whole idea is to create a sort of spatial ambiguity. And by collapsing plan and elevation, it creates like this weird dynamic between different planes or axes. And I thought that was an interesting take on designing a formal theory.
Bianca, would you mind sharing your screen again, just so if you have kind of a terminal model view or just.
There was a good
model view,
or maybe just something, just something that would just a sense of your project at its current state.
I could show you images of my miniatures model.
That's what I mean. That's, sorry.
So what this and the model itself talks about different, like from different angles it perceived differently. So when you look at it in elevation, almost looks like it looks collapsed into and looks very two-dimensional. But then when you look at it as a three-dimensional object, it actually has like more, it has like this perception of depth. And I'm also playing with like the stratification of layering on the inside, where it's almost like the second box or the inner volume wants to be the outer volume, but it's just not good enough.
Can you speak to why you chose to do this specific study for your miniature compared to some of your other studies?
I was trying to like compile all of the studies that I had, like most of the theories that I was thinking about into like one model. So this adds like the layering and the spatial ambiguity and also the idea of the perception of depth, and all of these like sort of like become this one object. And I thought it best explains my project in a way. I wish I had chosen different materials, like probably something more opaque, but yeah.
Could you maybe also, Priyanka, go back on your PDF to those pages where you had 3 or 4 things together?
Yeah.
Because those were kind of in aggregate, something like what you were trying to do. These, you have like 4 of these pages, 5 of them?
Yeah, I also
Explain
have
those.
like a page with everything.
Yeah, no, not the everything one. Just explain one of those.
Okay. These diagrams talk about this perception of depth and also like how it like encapsulates all of the qualities that I talk about. So this would be like layering of materials. So it adds also a spatial ambiguity because of like the opacity of the design on each of these polygons. And also talking of the layer, adding like stratification of layers and circulation diagram, which could be like either 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional, as you can see in this. So like these diagrams could be either a plan or an elevation, and it can switch between the two.
They're beautiful studies, and I want to find a way. I think I actually like of all the miniatures we've seen today, I actually think yours is sort of the most elegant and evocative in a way. I guess I'm wondering. It seems like you have a lot of room for variation within your system. And I feel like what you might need at the moment is more kind of determining it's a mundane way to look at it, but I feel like you need program to start making more of your decisions, I think, or biasing your decisions more, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think you have an architectural I think you have a strategy for developing the architecture and need more motive for doing so. This one, Andrew, I don't know if you remember Paul Wisecan. quite a few years ago. He ended up going to work for Apple for many years and doing better than most CI-Arc grads. But he and Jeffrey and Abba and I advised his thesis in the early 2000s, and Paul got obsessed with Ellsworth Kelly's early drawings that, like Daniel Buren's work, are based on the striped cabana fabric in France in the 50s. And Bianca, I don't know if you're familiar with either artist, Daniel Buren or Ellsworth Kelly. Probably, actually, this work of Kelly's is pretty very early, and I hadn't seen it before he pulled them out. But they remind me of how you're overlaying in the upper left-hand corner, the way the evenly spaced light and dark stripes are creating a kind of moire and shape simultaneously.
Yeah.
I think he was trying to go after in a different way many years ago, and might be worth a look. So to either side of your project, I'd pick some practical criteria to kind of sharpen your decision making, and maybe look a little bit at some of the artists who've taken up the compositional strategies you've already got a real fluency. So that's sort of I think that's the company you're in.
Can you go to the next page?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's nice. And with that,
I agree with Joe. I think you've got something really interesting, and your diagrams are really beautiful. You just need to kind of push it to that next step to try to make sense of some of these decisions and to kind of better explain them. I think maybe, and you might get to the point where your final thesis and you might not even include these diagrams or some of this kind of early research. But I think one of the things that kind of got us off to a slow start of critiquing is that you kind of created your own vocabulary, and it wasn't fully explained of what that vocabulary was. So we kind of were trying to make sense of your kind of world that you've created and your methodology that you're going through with creating this architecture. So I think maybe just trying to, if you're going to include it in the future, try to really think concisely about how you can explain these 4 different ways of creating these diagrams in like 2-3 sentences that is really clear, so that you can continue moving through your project, especially as you keep developing and keep getting more information. And it's going to get a lot more difficult to be able to explain all this kind of stuff. So you're going to need to make decisions of, again, like what's important to include and what's not. This may not be included, but if it is, trying to find that way that you can really concisely say it. And then I think as you continue working and you start developing this project further, a lot of it will not need explanation because it'll show in the work.
Yeah, I'm curious about the difference between the black one on the left and the pink and blue and gray one on the right. I'm sorry if I missed part of an explanation about how they're, if you describe the how they operate differently. I missed that because the audio, any kind of significant difference in your mind between working in all the black, this the color.
So the one on the left, I was trying to like imagine it more as an elevation where it sits on the ground and also has like a spatial quality of like entering the building and like how it also like fits into the ground. Whereas the other one, the one which is colored, would be more of, it's still like collapsible between plan and elevation, but it also shows circulation in a 3-dimensional aspect rather than a two-dimensional aspect.
But what about couldn't you have done the one on the right in all black too? Or couldn't you have done the one on the left in the colors as well, or no?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, but also trying to like eventually like I wanted to do like a series of color studies or theories to like apply to my materiality and facade detailing. And so the colored one was sort of a fast at that, but I'm not quite there yet. And I know I need to like work on that a little bit more.
I would suggest, to me anyway, there's a big difference between those two. And I don't see one being good and one being bad at all. But the one, I mean, and this is kind of fundamental, so I apologize for that. But the one on the left, just even visually, you know, leans much more toward a kind of consolidation of difference towards some sort of a compound object, whereas the one on the right wants to
We lost you.
quite a bit.
We lost you.
But you would need to resolve that.
I'm sorry, I kind of missed part of that.
Where did I leave off? Sorry.
After you mentioned compound object.
Ah, okay, you didn't miss much. Yeah, the one on the thing on the left is going to tend to push your work toward compound objects and kind of consolidation, I think. Yep. And at least just visually, whereas the one on the right is going to actively resist that. There's nothing. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong or right about the first. And usually oppositional. It's like centrifugality versus centripedality. One's not better than the other, but they're very different. So anyway, I would encourage you to think through that difference moving forward.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
It's beautiful drawings, by the way. I just love those.
You go to the next one. Priyanka, you went through these super fast.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
Okay. Funny. I'm thinking, I would keep on calling them diagrams, and I say, no, they're drawings. Then Joe called them studies, and everyone calls them diagrams.
Right. I wish Andrew would talk about, now.
There's too much, they're too much to just be diagrams. That's what's interesting about them. And yet, in terms of counting the number of lines, you want to call them that. I think Joe's got the,
I'm trying to find some silver lining in the Zoom world we live in, and at least I can find books in the middle of reviews. Are the Ellsworth Kelly drawings I was talking about. Here, there's some more. This is Ellsworth Kelly early drawings. Worth, frankly, order it from anyone from Amazon if you want to see it in less than 4 weeks. But I do think Jason is actually bringing up the kind of language that I think you need to that. I think I think there's a lot of contemporary work that's edging up against some of your interests, and I hope that whole sense of the play between interiority and exteriority and centripetal and centrifugal logic, a lot of O is tied up in those questions in interesting ways. Actually, Jason's work is itself in many ways.
Don't implicate me in anything.
Well, I love those drawings too, Priyanka, and I was thinking a bit about their difference to the miniature model, which once you get to that model, everything is transparent and becomes this kind of beautiful crystalline form. It made me think a little bit about how you will consider the interpretation of interiority from those diagrams, and perhaps this is some kind of gets to Jason's point about the difference between the two. It seemed like one thing, if you wanted this kind of super transparent surface that would produce some of these effects, it becomes quite a challenge, I suppose, to put something inside of there. And I would think that maybe one of these surfaces, and the way that I would read, especially I think the diagrams that were on the lower right, is that the exterior would almost in section like push into itself. Like I think I think Andrew uses the term involution in a sense, like a form that would somehow be both an exterior surface that would somehow then scoop back onto its interior. That somehow that would be a way. I mean, I was thinking almost of, I don't know why I have Herzog and de Meuron references today, but the Prada store, when the glass facade at some point, you know, becomes the kind of section, but not in all places. Now in yours, it seems like it would be a very different scale at the building, not at these kind of smaller scales. But the sense that this thing would perhaps be able to do that would still allow you to have some places where you would actually not have an interior object that you would actually be able to still see through, and then other places where that interior thing would somehow flatten things in the same way that that one diagram in the lower right would begin to flatten, you know, like kind of almost seem like there was no three-dimensionality to it. The other thing that I wonder about that model is how it deals with the ground. Now you have these beautiful sections, but when you have a kind of transparent model where there's a transparent bottom that works for an object, but curious in a building which doesn't have that side, that kind of imagined side in a way, what that would sort of imply for you to have like a kind of a study model which has a transparent bottom surface as it translates into a building which has no necessarily a real bottom surface. Like I'm curious about what that would mean too, and perhaps it would have something to do with this kind of sectional question or question of interiors as you move forward with it. So I don't know, I think there's some things that are gonna have to get reconciled between all of the intentions, and I think will be pretty interesting to see how it develops.
Maybe the Herzog and de Meuron trifecta would be the Laban Dance Center. The ground actually just goes up and down where it needs to.
Right.
It's not stuck into the ground, but the ground is manipulated.
But that also complicates, like I think your drawings complicate any idea of circulation. Like I think that there's something, and it's funny, Joe mentioned Paul's thesis. I remember this thesis specifically because like Paul's thesis used these colors, but he was really kind of strictly interested in surface. And I think that this is something that kind of goes beyond surface. And again, like you talk about brink and threshold, and it would seem that circulation would be kind of fundamentally complicated by the idea that, like, where do we enter this thing, and like, do we actually ever enter proper, or you know, like the kind of complications of things kind of oscillating and folding between in and out. And so I don't know, like the color to me insinuates much more of a, and this is maybe where it speaks back to the transparency, like whether, you know, the ability to see through things or the ability to move through things, those two things are not the same, right? And so opaqueness is going to be, I think, really important for you. Like moments of not seeing will actually produce, I think, a lot of the kind of things that we're looking at these drawings or you know, exercises or diagrams or whatever they are. Like they seem to be transparent, but actually I think opaqueness in the physicality of the model or how the thing actually works will produce those kind of illegibilities in moments where you want them to have those effects.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priyanka. I think we're at our 20 minutes. So if there isn't any other comment for Priyanka, we can include it. Otherwise, I think we are finished for the day. Is that right, Andrew?
We are finished. This is fantastic. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, congrats to all the students. Yeah.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you.
Good job, guys.
Thank you to the jury for coming.
We all have a lot of work ahead of us, but thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Everyone's presentation.
I wish we were all at Hauser and Wirth for a cocktail after this.
You know,
I think we should be playing some music right now, just like for the last half hour.
This is the frustration.
Good to see wonderful to see the work and some old friends. Jason, it's great to see you. I'm missing you, and Debbie. This whole alumni theme to the reviews. I hope this keeps going over the summer.
Love you, Jeff.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. It's a real pleasure to see all of your smiling faces in the middle of the summer.
Richard, for putting up with, you know, being the small end of the presentation whale today.
I thought I was really glad to be able to see other students' work. You know, like being isolated, we don't really get that chance very often, at least in this depth.
You know, when we meet, we usually have one Zoom meeting and people just kind of keep it on in the background.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you guys ever want to do something where we just get together, even on more informally, to talk about these projects, we would be happy to do that. I'm inviting my students. I'm not so happy to do what my students are.
I'd be happy to. I think that'd be great. Cool.
Great. And I don't think I think we're set then, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.